kind of a framework and a base framework rely on either the US or the EU to kind of start with, you're going to have to find the same sort of model, I think, in crypto. What's the country model that you're going to adopt, and do that more broadly for your business operations in order to succeed?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I'd like to go back to a point that you made, Julie, that has been made really across the panel about effectively the kind of regulation that would be prompted by mainstream crypto adoption. And if I may, we can perhaps focus a little bit on the states. And Yahya pointed out that the states has been perhaps ahead of the game when it comes to certain crypto risks, but perhaps not others. I think that if you look at what the Office of Foreign Assets Control, what the DOJ has done more broadly, has been to sort of regulate by enforcement. That's been a phrase that's been levied at the US government when it comes to its approach to crypto. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what's been the case? I mean, I suppose in terms of the SEC and the CFTC, there's still a wrestling match for jurisdiction over this industry. But in terms of enforcement cases, we've seen some pretty significant ones come across our desk just over the last few months alone. What coordination do you think perhaps is lacking in the states in terms of, coordinating an effective national approach to crypto, and what risks might arise if that coordination doesn't actually become more thorough and better understood in the years to come? Julie, why don't we stick with you for this one?
Oh, absolutely. I think coordination is desperately needed. The private sector and innovators are looking for coordination, but if there's coordination in crypto, that'll be the first area that there's coordination in. And, so US law enforcement is really known for, frankly, grabbing on to jurisdiction, and every little agency that has a piece of things looking for their role. And that's what we're seeing here in crypto. That's what we saw in traditional financial crime. That's what we've seen in trade controls. It's traditionally US. We also, of course, have the states. And so all the states, the money transmitter requirements, they're all a little bit different. Their audits are different. The New York Department of Financial Services are all weighing in a different way. I think coordination as a whole is good for the industry, but who it's bad for? Sometimes it's bad for kind of honest people that want to do business, because sometimes coordination can make law enforcement less effective. You actually can be better when you're coming at it from many different angles. And so while I wish there was coordination, and I think we thought there was great hope with Biden's, digital asset, push and statement that there'd be coordination, I think knowing the US government, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see it. And I think, frankly, it might be good in our efforts for crime that different agencies are pursuing things in different ways, because they may have different successes. I think about OFAC, for example. OFAC was really pushed ahead by the New York Department of Financial Services on some of the Iranian asset issues. OFAC was not really moving. They were really sitting. And so New York DFS was very aggressive with banks like BNP Paribas, and then OFAC became more aggressive. So sometimes a little friendly competition, lack of coordination, that can reduce the amount of crime, not encourage it.
That's an interesting take. Yahya, I saw you nodding your head during Julie's response there. What are your thoughts on the perceived lack of coordination that's been levied across the US government as it relates to crypto regulation?
I won't say much. I think Julie really captured it. I mean, maybe I'll just emphasize the point that flexibility is very, very important, right? And especially in law enforcement, as she pointed out. And I think a lot of what the crypto community has been saying is, first of all, there can't be a one size fits all approach, right? I mean, that's the thing, I think. And I think those of us, we've been following crypto for so many years. I think, there's a learning curve that regulators, legislators, law enforcement sort of have to go through, right? When they first look at this thing, it looks like this. And then you have the issue that you have all the blind men holding different parts of the elephant, saying what it is to them, because hey, that's what they're touching, that's what they're dealing with. So I think we're in this learning curve or adoption curve on the other side, where governments are really trying to figure out, well, what is the best approach? I actually think, again, sort of as a watcher of the industry, looking at understanding this technology for the past several years, I actually say there is a bit of a good story, right? Back in 2016, I remember when, again, what is Bitcoin, and giving presentations and in front of audiences of, again, very educated educated people working in government and getting questions like, so how do I hold the Bitcoin? You know, like what is this? Is not understanding it. And I'd say that despite the uncertainty and the sort of, little bit of political football that there is much more understanding in the policymaker community about crypto, about how it works. So I am actually optimistic, even though there seem to be a lot of fissures between agencies.
But I do think there will continue to be regulation by enforcement. They're just not going to get ahead of that. And so, what the private sector needs to be doing is continuing to focus on these enforcement actions, looking at, statements that are made, frankly, in press releases or in settlements as guidance on what's going to be accepted, what's not going to be accepted, and how they need to change their compliance programs.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about stablecoins, but before I do, Jeffrey, I'd like to pose the same question to you before we move on.
I mean, not much to add here. I mean, from the perspective of a highly regulated financial institution, right, at federal and state levels, I think we try to look at this by disaggregating some of what I think is commonly kind of sucks a lot of the energy out of the room, which is who has jurisdiction, and is this a security, and if so, what attaches to it. And really, from our perspective, the thing that we work on, which is much more how we apply blockchain and things that we already know are securities or know are not securities, and so and I think the thing that we're looking for, right, is kind of to continue working with the regulators that we already have looking after us, right, to find ways to innovate on those types of applications. We think there's enormous promise there, and frankly, I mean that having a financial sector in the U.S. that can be more efficient, be faster, right, reach more people at lower costs, that contributes something to economic security as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think I'll stick with you for this next question, Jeffrey, because I think that you'll have some really interesting insights to kick us off. There's been some reports shared online about a potentially gold-backed stablecoin that's being floated by Russia and Iran. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on this potential project, specifically what it might mean for the US going forward, and also more broadly Western sanctions.
Yeah, if you kind of look at the evolution of sanctions, which actually dates back to a couple hundred years. People think it started right after 9/11, but it was actually the U.S. inserting itself into a dispute between the England and France at the time. You look at the evolution of this, right? It's only recently that we began to go after countries that have much larger and connected economies, both in terms of trade relationships, but also financial and capital markets, and more technological sophistication. So sanctioning a country like Russia is very different than sanctioning something like Cuba, right? Or Myanmar, right? Or I mean, like, you can kind of go down the OFAC list and see the various sanctions programs that are in effect. And as you go after larger targets, right, larger, more connected, more sophisticated countries that have more resources, and they are linked to other countries that are more dependent on them because they're more connected, the incentive, right, to develop alternatives to the existing architecture has also increased. So that, I think, is what gives rise to some of these experiments, whether it's old telex systems, right, being set up in Russia to get around SWIFT, or it's a Russia-Iran gold-backed stablecoin, or what have you, that you can look at this in a variety of iterations. At the end of the day, though, right, I mean, the stabilizing forces around the dollar are, in my view, pretty strong, right? So people still want to invoice in dollars. They still want to remit payments generally in dollars against those dollar invoices. They want to raise capital in US markets in dollars, debt and equity. There's a legal framework for dollar contracts, right? There's the credibility of the Fed and the stability of our currency. There's the sheer quantity, frankly, of dollar debt instruments that are available to invest your FX reserves in. And it's not clear to me that those are close to being replaced necessarily by some of these things, but it's something we have to be sensitive to, especially as the G7 and others coordinate more, or are signaling their desire to coordinate more, to use sanctions as a tool of statecraft in more and more areas, right? If Russia was a lesson in coordinating those tools in a way to achieve broader foreign policy objectives in a way that we haven't seen in the past, right? continuing to wield it in that manner should just have us looking at and seeing what types of alternatives could become more concerning over time.
And as well, you mentioned there, Jeffrey, that Russia already has some existing alternatives to, for example, the SWIFT system. Julie, maybe I will direct this next question to you. Just in terms of the efficacy of a gold-backed stablecoin between Russia and Iran, I suppose the existence of these alternatives already begs the question, why an additional alternative? I think the question from some skeptics would be, would a stablecoin be needed for Russia to evade Western sanctions? And if so, to what degree can it actually be useful?
I think there are a lot of ways that Russia and sanctions parties seek to evade sanctions. I don't know that you need a new stable coin to do so. And in fact, I think that's kind of advertising that you're doing that versus using another method. I think the points that Jeffrey made about the importance of the dollar and the dominance of the dollar continue. You could see if there was this kind of a stable coin that the US would issue sanctions against any country or party accepting that stable coin. And so, then it start to spiral down. But I think it's something that has to continue to be monitored and continue to focus. We can't always count on the dollar being dominant, right? And so, if other countries came up with this idea, not Russia and Iran, maybe it'd be a more significant threat. And I think we do have to kind of pay attention and make sure that our financial system is in order and our house is in order and our country acts in appropriate ways to, maintain the dominance of the dollar.
Yeah, those are some interesting insights. Yahya, I'm interested to know what your view is on a potential stablecoin between Russia and Iran.
I mean, I think a lot has been said on that in particular, and I would echo those statements. I think what everyone is pointing out is that this is maybe part of it, or what I'll say is that the thing to watch is really this experimentation that's happening all around, right? And countries learn. Countries are learning about what works and what may be a better approach to try to evade sanctions. A few years ago, very quietly, Venezuela was probably the first to create its own cryptocurrency that the Maduro regime said was to evade sanctions. And like Julie said, boom, it was sanctioned, it was sanctioned right away. So it did make a difference. It didn't change their fundamentals. But if I know we're probably, because I think in the chat, even the China has come up, right? And obviously we're going to talk about China. So I'll before we get into China, if I can share, I think what we have to be mindful of is, when it comes to the US dollar, it's not so much direct competition that, is an issue. Displacing the dollar as a global reserve currency in the next year or two. That's not going to happen for an array of reasons. But let's take a page out of history, because I think sometimes we think about these shifts and we're only looking to what happened after World War II, and that's kind of where we're starting. But I want to go back further. I think about economic shifts from the 15th century. And if you remember, think about one situation. Think about Portugal. Portugal was a small country in the Iberian Peninsula that was looking for its economic goal, which was to get to the Orient. And to get there, it had to go, through the Middle East, through Africa. And there was a Portuguese leader, Prince Henry the Navigator, who said, what? I wonder if instead of trying to go over land and go directly through those same trade routes to get to the Orient, quote unquote, that's the term they used back then. He said, he was into navigation. Why don't we innovate? Why don't we build off the technology that has been available for centuries and then try to create better seafaring? And they created a new route. And that sort of changed the landscape. It opened up the age of exploration, made coastal cities more important. And what did you have? Portuguese became a huge power because of this technological innovation. The lesson there for me is that, what is often important is, an adversary figuring out, or a power figuring out, maybe we should play a different game. Maybe it shouldn't be just playing the same game as our adversary. And I think a lot of this experimentation is in that bucket of, okay, yeah, maybe we can figure out. Now there's going to be experimentation. Some of it won't work. Some of these things will phase out. But as we sort of maybe start talking about China, what you see is maybe a more concerted effort, a more serious effort to use technology and to try to coordinate pilots to get countries to experiment with alternative routes, alternative channels for payments. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating point. And I do want to jump into China. I think we'll jump on China next. But while we're on the subject of sanctions evasion, I think it would be interesting to briefly discuss Ukraine. And I think that this has become the sort of marquee issue when it comes to sanctions evasion through the broader technology of digital assets. So you've got advocates for crypto will say that folks have been able to donate to Ukraine's cause effectively and quickly, and at times anonymously, which is a good thing. Although on the other side of the debate, some folks will say that the existence of cryptocurrency has enabled some Russian actors to evade sanctions. So there's two sides to the coin here, pardon the pun. But Jeffrey, we can start with you on this front. What are your views writ large on the crypto industry's general impact on bad actors and their ability to evade sanctions?
I think anytime there's a new technological innovation, right, that isn't as subject to as much regulation, right, or if you want to call it, or in the industry is still maturing in its ability to detect and root out and report kind of bad actors, it's going to be abused, right? So I think so. Some amount of that, I think, is going on, and that's unfortunate. And over time, right, I think as we harden the infrastructure around this and the endpoints, as this gets into the kind of regulated financial system, right, those entry and exit points, you can start to lower the potential for that to be abused. I mean, that being said, though, right, I mean, I think, again, if you're thinking about the opportunity set here for Ukraine, which is a country that's going to have to rebuild itself, right, in the wake of all of this, and had a prior history of a financial sector that was weaker than probably it should have been, right, and was subject to some integrity issues of its own over time, right? I mean, you can think about how you apply this technology in the wake of this to really build a robust, efficient financial infrastructure in a country that is capable of facilitating capital flows to proper investment, right? Capable of facilitating remittances from Ukrainian diaspora that are that want to see their homeland rebuilt. And so I think there are also opportunities here, as much as there are kind of risks that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, very good points all around. Julie, what's your view generally on the impact crypto has had as an industry on the sanctions evasion industry itself?
On the sanctions evasion industry itself, it's just another tool, right? It's another way. You don't have to carry your cash in the duffel bag like they did in the old HSBC days, right? Or you don't have to use Hawala. You can now use crypto. I think there are advantages for law enforcement because everything is kind of traceable and reviewable in a way that it's not always when you're kind of handing over cash. But it definitely is a challenge, and I think law enforcement historically was playing a bit of catch up, right? So it took them a while. And certainly I think the tools, now there are a lot of good market tools that help with tracing, Blockchain Explorer, other things that really can ensure that law enforcement can be effective. But I think it's been a couple of years. And I think if you look at the FBI's just recent success with Hive, right, and getting money back in ransomware, that was not happening, pre-crypto. If you're giving money in cash or some other way, you weren't necessarily getting it back. And so I think that there are some advantages. I think, like others have said, it's any tool can be used for good or for evil. I think with Ukraine, though, it's been great given that things are disrupted. Traditional banking, money flows could be disruptive. To have a way to get money there quickly is, I think, really important.
Interesting. Yeah, if we can perhaps round off that subject with you, and then I know that we're keen to jump into China, so perhaps I'll stick with you for the next question as well.
I agree with everything everyone has said.
Cool. Well, in that case, yeah, then why don't we just dive into China? I think that one adjacent issue to digital assets, or to crypto, I should say, is the existence of obviously CBDCs. And one thing that jumps to my mind whenever I think of CBDCs is Jerome Powell, who I think said a good couple of years ago now that it's more important to be right on this than to be first. Of course, on the other side of the world, China is fairly far along on their CBDC project. So I'd like to put the question to you: what is the role of CBDCs as it captures US-China competition?
Interesting question. There are a lot of dimensions to this, and I think I'll sort of take one particular tack on it. In fact, I'll give a little preview because back at the Center for New American Security, a colleague, Emily Jin, and I are working on another report on China's digital currency that we hope will be out in a few weeks. So look out for that. And what we did with our latest research is we actually, there's already the story about the surveillance side of the CBDC, and we decided to explore a little bit further into the past year. There have been over 100, 100 plus pilots of China's CBDC called the ECNY. That's one of that's the popular term. And I think the way we're looking at this, if you want to think about the competition angle, it may be through the lens of China is creating more functional money. It's really creating more programmable money in ways that already do exist in different forms of payments, but has never really been implemented at scale in sort of national fiat money. And one of the things, so it's interesting. So a lot of what we're seeing with some of these ECNY pilots are very rudimentary smart contracts. So one perfect example is like putting money in, doing payments where you put money in escrow. So basically to try to mitigate counterparty risk, with suppliers or with certain services, you pay the money and it goes into a smart contract wallet. And then when services are rendered, then it's released into the other person's, into the person's account, right? And otherwise it goes back to the original buyer. And there are a lot of little things like that, which they're implementing broadly in these little pilots. Why is that significant? It's significant because this is sort of an approach to make more programmable functional money, which definitely has its downsides, right? Can be used to cut people out by the state, by the central bank or whatever. But also they're experimenting to try to make money more functional. And I'll maybe just, there's so much we can talk about China. I'll just sort of drop that there, that if the United States, whether it does a CBDC or not, doesn't consider that money is changing, that there are other functions and other formats of money, and that a country like China is really forward leaning and trying to push the limits and is looking for more innovation and more data capture. So there's like a whole sort of strategic play that's happening with China's CBDC. And if we just see it as, oh, well, is it going to compete with the dollar in foreign exchange markets? Like, no, that's not the issue. Again, see the shift over centuries, right? When people try to innovate in order to find an alternative, some alternative value.
Yeah, no, those are some really interesting points that you've made there. And I think, the point that you make about scale in particular is something that perhaps is often overlooked when people discuss China's CBDC. Jeffrey, what are your thoughts on China's progress on that front and how it may impact the states going forward?
Yeah, I think it's kind of going back to what I said maybe at the top. Everybody starts from a different structure of their financial sector and their society and their markets and the rest, right? And I think what has allowed China, right, to make substantial progress, right, is the fact that some of the largest banks, which are the wallet providers, are state-owned banks. So there's the coordination of industry and government and policy enabled them to move faster. They also arguably have less at stake, right? So to Jerome Powell's point, to be right or to be first, we have to get it right because there are dozens of countries around the world that use the dollar as their de facto or official currency, de jure currency. We have the large, deep capital markets that China itself uses to issue it, right? So the stakes for us to get this right, and not just right in terms of a technological architecture, but right in terms of an economic architecture, is much more important. The stakes are just so much higher for the U.S. I mean, you can think of a scenario where, here we are on the eve of a potential rate hike by the Federal Reserve. A rate hike that gets transmitted into the economy through a combination of capital markets and banks, right? And if you change the architecture for that fundamentally shifts, right? How people and firms interact with, kind of financial intermediaries in the system. Your ability to influence the macroeconomic environment could fundamentally change. And so if you don't know how to do that, right, you could actually start messing things up pretty easily. So I think that, taking it into Yaya's point, the risk of, my mother using the ECNY in California is not high, right? If it's rolled out, right? I mean, her that's just not something that should be interested in doing. I think there is interesting aspects to this in terms of other parts of Chinese foreign policy, in terms of whether this gets extended to places that don't have other options, right? But in terms of competition in the U.S. market, I think that is quite limited.
Thanks for those points, Jeffrey. Julie, why don't we round off this subject with you before we pivot perhaps to audience's questions? I'll remind the audience that you can ask some questions and we'll pick them up in a few minutes.
Sure. I think Yahya and Jeffrey really hit on, I think, some of the key points. The only other thing I would add is I think the important role for Congress to play and really pushing the U.S. government to look at this seriously. I agree that it's more important to be right than to be first, but we also should not be last. And I think that would have a negative, detrimental effect on our national security. And I think we should really be thinking about what's going on and making sure that it's being evaluated. And I think Congress really needs to step up its role here to kind of push the executive branch on this.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And if I may start the Q&A session slightly early, because there's a question that rolls off the tongue, so to speak, with what you've just mentioned there, Julie. And this question comes from Jefferson Barry, who is asking if US leadership is actually diminishing with China's perceived rise in this digital asset space more broadly. Perhaps we'll stick with you, Julie, for this question, then we'll pivot to the rest of the panel.
I mean, I'd be interested in the perspective of others. I don't think the U.S. Leadership is diminishing at this point, but I think there are many entities that are looking for alternatives. I think there are countries that are poor that are looking for other things. And so I think the opportunity is there for the U.S.'s leadership to diminish if we don't kind of really keep the stake, keep moving hard and keep thinking hard and keep thinking also in a way that is industry friendly, consumer friendly, and is not kind of irrational. So right now I think we're okay, but I think it's something that has to be watched. But I'd be very interested in Yahya and Jeffrey's take on that.
Yeah, same. Yahya, why don't we go to you next? Perhaps I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but is there a specific time frame that you can maybe share with us where you think, this is where there is a tipping point where US leadership would be at risk, and when would we maybe hit that point?
Yeah, I can't predict or project that. I mean, I think that the thing, I'm used to, sort of as an analyst coming from the Intel world, right? I mean, what you want to do is you want to identify maybe indicators of change. What are some of the things that you would see for some sort of far off situation, or even a black swan, or, low probability, you might think, situation? What are the things that you would see? So the dollar being eclipsed by, let's say, a CBDC would be one of those things. And you would probably see a lot of experimentation and investment. You would see a lot of trials, standard making by other countries. You would probably see that this would not just be an adversary to the US trying to do this, like Julie said, right? This is a CBDC, and an alternative system is something that's aspired to by friend and foe of the US, right? The UK had been considering it in some form. And many other countries are not necessarily happy with having to depend on the US dollar. So I think that, while we might not say, oh yeah, short term, it's not an issue, but there should be no sense of being impervious or that in perpetuity that the U.S. is going to have this position. I won't say that sharks are in the water and they're smelling blood. It's not that situation, but it is a situation where you could imagine maybe a political shift. So, there are a lot of things that could happen, right, that are unforeseen. War, lots of other things that could maybe spark a change. So that's why all of these little things, even though they're not going to displace the U.S. right away, have to be paid attention to.
Yeah. Jeffrey, what about your thoughts on the same subject?
Yeah, I mean, nothing's for granted, right? So just because the U.S. enjoys this position today, both in terms of the size and strength of its economy and the status that its currency has in the world, is the result of a series of choices, right? So, and the ability to continue to enjoy that position also as a result of choices, right? And those choices get more complicated when people are demanding more features from the money, right? So and so to Yaya's point, I can't pinpoint where on the timeline that starts to invert, right? But you can see a scenario, right, that if you have old tech money in the U.S. And the financial sector itself, right, can't apply blockchain in the same types of meaningful ways that it can in other places, and so loses out on the efficiency and the reach, and is no longer price competitive, and we're settling on timelines that are much longer, right, than other jurisdictions. You can see how over time this becomes a competitive disadvantage, and these are currently the things that give us the competitive advantage for kind of mutually reinforcing the dollar's role in the world, whether it's digital or old tech. And so I think as much as this is about trying to get the features of the money right, we do have to monitor kind of the pace of where our where our competitors are too, because this is a relevant factor. It is a competition.
I'd like to actually, there's an interesting question that's come in to the call from Aaron Arriaga, who asked, I mean, a lot of the focus of this conversation has been foreign policy challenges and international security risk. And maybe we can pivot slightly with this question from Aaron, who asks, what potential does cryptocurrency have in allowing external powers or groups financing illicit activity within the US? Julie, why don't we kick this question off with you?
I mean, there's a lot of potential, right? We definitely have seen that criminals have moved to using crypto for their illicit activities. And so it's just as any tool opens up, and that's part of why, the US, right, banned Tornado and doesn't like some of the privacy coins and those things, because there's a concern, mixers, that certain things are used more often for harm than for good, right? So definitely that there is a lot of illicit activity in the US that is in crypto. There's a lot that's not, right? And so sometimes what we see when we're investigating things or using Chainalysis or Elliptic is that people are not very smart. And so when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we used to say if the criminals weren't done, we wouldn't catch them, right? So there are a lot of people on the blockchain that are not very smart. And so, the FBI and others can track them, but absolutely, this is not just an international problem. It's a problem right here, and people are, being taken for all kinds of assets. Every day at Guidepost, we get emails from people saying they've been taken, they've been a victim of a scam, and trying to get their money back. So it's definitely a domestic problem as well as a problem internationally.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid point to make. Yaya, do you have anything to add?
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is, again, looking at this over time. And one thing I will say is, Julie mentioned all the different blockchain analysis tools that are out there. And, interestingly, I mean, the U.S. law enforcement is getting very good. I mean, getting very skilled, doing more training, building more analytic centers. I mean, this is a high priority issue, again, compared to 5-6 years ago when it was very niche. So, insight into criminal activity on the blockchain is really growing. It's a growth industry, but I think the preparedness that the government has actually increased.
And one of the things I would just add is that the government is really looking for industry to step up if they are a victim of a ransomware attack or something else. They're looking for more partnership, and they think they can do more to help. And the FBI just took down, Hive, found the encryption keys, got, a bunch of people their money back. And that's something they weren't doing in the past. And they want to show that they're more on the side of industry and helping you. And so I think that is something to think about. Do you reach out to law enforcement if you have this kind of a problem?
Yeah. Before we move on to the next question, Jeffrey, I'd like to know if you have perhaps anything to add to the subject.
Nothing to add on this one.
Fair.
Well covered by the two people who are more experts on this than me.
Agreed. That was a thorough conversation on that subject. If I may ask, I think this would be of benefit to the audience generally as well. One part of the world that we haven't discussed really at any point in this panel is North Korea. It's often been made the case that North Korea is economically quite significantly reliant on crypto, and that their illicit crypto industry has gone to some length of financing its illicit missile programs. I think, in the eyes of some, this is the single most significant national security threat facing the United States that is linked to the crypto industry. And I wonder if anybody has any particular thoughts on that subject. Jeffrey, why don't we start with you if you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think this is the latest in a long chain of essentially criminal state behavior by North Korea, right? Who has long financed its regime through, you know, one criminal enterprise or another over many decades. So it doesn't surprise me that they are now using kind of the weaknesses in this architecture to make profit. And you know, I think again, so much of this, I think, from a policy consideration, right, needs to be looked at in terms of yes, the advantages and disadvantages of certain coins and instruments and regulations and the rest. But I think some of this fundamentally is also about how much of this is a debate about what is centralized and decentralized. And by the way, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, right? And there may be better applications for some in the centralized versus decentralized and vice versa. But this is a situation where a decentralized network, right, leaves open, right, the possibility for somebody to abuse it because there is no central enforcement. And so we have to think about that. More broadly on that particular subject, I think I think a lot of advocates think decentralized kind of is the superior option. And I guess maybe I'll just ask people, I mean, the North Korea example being one aspect of it, right? But to really think about your conviction there, because so much of how normal people use money, right, is that they actually kind of like some amount of friction in the system, right? They like the ability that if I enter in the wrong bank routing number, I can get my money back. Or that if somebody steals my credentials or my card, it's covered by some fraud reimbursement measure, right? And so I think the balance, right, of central and decentralized, whether it's in a security aspect or in a usability aspect, is one that I think this kind of forces.
But I think that's a false sense of security sometimes. If you look at the issues with Zelle, with the ATM cards, I think people think I'm using more traditional methods, and so my money is safe, I'll get it back, and I won't necessarily. But I mean, I think you raise excellent points, but I think sometimes there is a sense of security that's maybe not properly founded.
Yeah, and this is sort of there's an ongoing thing here, right? Because maybe this tension that we're seeing in like the technological adoption and advancement and the gap between sort of everyday people. I mean, actually funny, Jeffrey, I also have a mother in California. My mom is also in California, right? She's not going to get on a crypto or DeFi platform, right? She's just not going to do it. She's going to stick to what she knows. But I just had a thought when both of you were speaking, which is maybe though this tension is North Korea using crypto is not a good thing, right? But what happens though is that bad actors they have their own adoption curve. And what tends to happen is like, there's this new innovation, let's say it's DeFi, there's something that maybe it's outside the, regulations don't really apply. And then it gets adopted and then there's more attention to it. Now, what tends to happen with regulators is they sort of behind the curve, they're thinking, wow, well, how do we deal with this? And it takes, my sort of mantra is, regulators tend to be, at least 18 months behind where the innovation is, right? When, and I think that's maybe being very optimistic or liberal, right? They're usually, a year or two behind. But where we are now with things like what happened with Tornado Cash, I think regulators are now really trying to figure out, okay, this stuff is here. These type of platforms exist. We do need to figure out how we're going to address them. And many people are saying, well, you can't use the same AML framework, regulatory framework that we had. So you know what it means? It means smart people have to really start thinking through, like, is there a way? How do we approach this? And there are going to be lots of proposals. Hey, BIS has thrown out some stuff. Other international agencies are thinking about this, and in the US, within 18 months, 2 years, we probably will have a semblance of a framework to deal with some of these platforms. Now, the thing is, another 18 months, especially with crypto, things will still innovate, so we'll be behind. But that's the game.
Yeah, that's a very, very good observation. Yaya, thank you everybody for those really useful insights. We have just over 5 minutes left. So Perhaps I'll invite the panel to make some closing summarizing statements, and I'll also leave you with a final question from an anonymous attendee to this call, who is asking, what is currently stopping the US from creating their own stablecoin? And if they were to do so at any point, what political and security concerns might arise from such a undertaking? Yahya, why don't we stick with you, and then we'll go down to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, a lot of the things which were referenced in terms of, how much there is to lose, the financial stability, that's just one thing. It wouldn't be a simple thing for the U.S. to create its own either CBDC or its own stable coin, even sort of how to address stable coin regulation as it is, right? That's a huge, complicated undertaking that the U.S. government is actually thinking about. So very, I'll pause there.
Fair enough. Jeffrey, why don't we pivot to you next?
Yeah, maybe I'll end where I started, which is in the government's view of what money is, right? In terms of what it needs to serve for policy purposes is, I don't think very well understood. And so, and this is to your question on stable coins, right? It gets exactly to this. Can the government borrow in its stable coin, right? Can the government, will that work? Will the government be able to make sure that there's the proper amount of critical imports that can get financed? Will enough of those trading partners trust it? Will Goldman Sachs conduct repo using that as a medium, right? I mean, so you think about kind of the things that the government cares about, right, are very different than I think what technologists are kind of thinking about. And by the way, I studied computer science. At one point, I thought I was a technologist. It turns out I was a very bad programmer. But I think there's a way to think through these things from the prerogative of the government, like, or what are they caring about? And I think the more we kind of ask that question, or at least have it in the back of our mind first, as we think through whether it's a policy consideration or a feature or a new product or service offering, if you're an entrepreneur, you're less likely to run into issues, right? And I think the good news is, right, as the government is slowly elucidating more and more of these types of priorities, which is different than we were 5 years ago. It was very focused on compliance years ago, and now it actually is moving to this kind of like, the darker or the deeper kind of considerations that the government cares about. So you actually have more information now to inform that view than you ever had. That's the good news. Thanks.
It's a very good point as well, that I think that broadly speaking, politicians and technologists perhaps are not thinking along the same lines generally, and that's an interesting observation. Julie, you have the opportunity to make the closing statement of the panel.
Well, since this is NSI, and since I know that there are a number of law students on the call, as well as perhaps folks from the Hill, I just want to encourage you to think about government service, either on the Hill or inside the government. As you can see from what Yahya and Jeffrey and Scott have said, it's a really exciting time. There are a lot of things that are up in the air, and we need folks that are really interested and smart and creative to come into the government and help wrestle through these issues and think through these issues, so it can be the right kinds of regulatory framework that promotes innovation, but it's also compliant. So that's my pitch for today.
Good stuff. Thanks everyone again for a really engaging panel, and thank you to the audience for tuning in and asking some really thoughtful questions. Sorry that we didn't have time, of course, to get to all of them. With that, I will pivot back to John, and thanks again to everybody for attending the panel.
Well, thank you so much, Scott Cipollina, for moderating today's panel. Thank you to our amazing guests, Yahya Fanusi, Jeffrey Acamolo, Julie Myers-Wood, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you also for our audience for asking some great questions and helping out with today's discussion. Just quickly, a few programming notes on behalf of NSI. We have a great event coming up next week on Tuesday, February 7th. We're going to be hosting a special happy hour reception for female congressional staffers who work on national security and foreign policy issues. For further details on timing and location for that, please visit the events page on our website. That's www.nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. In addition to that, we're also going to be kicking off our global repression programming for 2023. Next month in February, in our first event, we will examine ongoing collaborations between oppressive regimes and highlight how this common alignment is a threat to U.S. national security and that of our partners and allies. More details on that will be available soon on our website. And finally, please do not forget to check out our flagship podcast, Fault Lines, where Jamil Jaffer, Jessica Jones, and Les Munson get you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists. I'm John Paulson. Have a great day.